Want to start a podcast, or are you already a podcast host? What would you say if I told you that you can get paid up to $31 per guest you interview, and I can help you book those guests? If you want to start making more money with your podcast right now and interview great guests who your listeners will love, it's not too good to be true. It's Podmatch. If you use my Podmatch link in the show notes right now, Podmatch will pay you up to $31 per interview. Yes, up to $31 per interview. I did not stutter. If you want to make more money from your podcast while expanding your reach and getting more listeners, simply click our Podmatch link in the show notes right now to check out this really cool opportunity. I've said it before and I'm going to say it again. Your listeners are on a battlefield and they're trying to accomplish a mission. And when you understand how a battlefield works, you'll understand how to make your podcast work by helping your listeners win. As your listeners face the enemies holding them back, we talked about in the last episode, they're facing one of the most powerful weapons of those enemies that those enemies have in their arsenals. And what is that? It's called propaganda. What is propaganda? Simply put, it's deceptive messaging used by an enemy to try to deceive, demoralize, and defeat you. Okay, this is psychological warfare. Oh, and be sure to grab the free Speak Your Listener's Language PDF. Again, it's a simple 3-page PDF that's going to show you 7 super simple keys to easily crafting a powerful brand message for your podcast that will make your podcast more appealing to more of the right people so your show will grow. So look, if you want more people to notice your podcast more often and subscribe to it, go grab it right now. It's free. Just click the link in the show notes that says Speak Your Listener's Language right now. I remember learning about this for the first time, really seeing it, when I was stationed with the U.S. Army's 2nd Infantry Division in South Korea, because I actually went to the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone, the border between North and South Korea, very hostile place. And it was interesting because there were these propaganda speakers facing southbound into South Korea, where I was, from North Korea, basically promoting, 24/7, these loudspeakers in Hangul, which is Korean, basically touting why North Korea's way of life is superior and people should think better and convert to their way of thinking, because they knew that over time, they think with propaganda generally, over time, if you speak a message long enough, loud enough, a certain percentage of people will tend to believe it. All right. So I saw this and I realized, we do that to ourselves all the time in our own heads. If you want to keep your listeners' attention and give them real value, so they'll subscribe and keep listening to your podcast, you need to speak to the propaganda going through their own head that is caused by the enemy on their battlefield. The thing they're dealing with in the world, you need to address the thoughts going through their head, through their minds, about that thing that are caused by that thing. And in this episode, I'm going to show you how to identify the propaganda in your listeners' heads so they'll begin to see you as the one who can lead them and advise them and help get them from where they are to an outcome they want to have. In other words, the pathway across the minefield, and they don't want to get blown up, so they want to follow your instruction to help them get where they want to go. Are you looking for an easy way to record your podcast episodes in world-class high quality, edit them into Flash, and make them live without all the technical headaches and confusion? Then you're in luck. Riverside FM is the premier podcast recording software that allows you to produce the same high-quality podcasts as other world-famous podcasters your listeners are already enjoying. Level up your podcast right now, even if you're brand new. Maybe you're not a techie and you don't have a lot of time, so you can attract more listeners to your podcast consistently. Simply click the Riverside FM link in the show notes right now to grow your podcast to the next level, starting today. Your listeners have these propaganda messages going through their heads every single day that come from their enemy, that are stopping them from accomplishing what they want or getting where they want to be. It's the negative thoughts, doubts, fears, bad feelings, emotions, stories, and all those things that go through their heads that hang them up and slow them down as they seek to accomplish their mission, whatever that is. We talked about that in episode 1. If you haven't listened to it, go back. It's the who and the what. All right, who are they and what do they want? Clarifying that, I'll talk about that in episode 1. But these propaganda pieces come directly from their clearly identified enemy that we talked about in the previous episode. So make sure you're identifying that. It makes this a lot easier. So back to my examples, military speaking that I did, as well as this podcast. 2 examples here of what I mean by this episode, by this point I'm making with propaganda. When I was speaking to military veterans on marriage, the enemy was all these things like money, communication, whatever it was. We talked about it in the last episode. But what was the propaganda being caused by those enemies? It was thoughts like this: your spouse is the enemy, or he's impossible to talk to, or he's not the man I married, this will never work, or there's no talking to her, or communicating with her is impossible, or the thought that most military marriages end in divorce, so mine probably will too. These are all emotions and thoughts and feelings and stories that go on in people's heads concerning that. So if I had a podcast on that, that is the propaganda I would be speaking to, because it's what's already going on in their head. You want to enter the conversation already going on in the heads of your listeners. I didn't come up with that. I don't remember who said it, but it's true. Now think about this podcast. This podcast helps podcasters grow their podcast by clarifying their brand message so they get noticed and the podcast will grow. Well, here's some propaganda you might recognize if you're trying to grow a podcast, which if you're a podcaster, you're listening to this is for you, so it works. I'm so frustrated and I feel stuck. I do all this work and my podcast isn't growing. I feel like quitting. This isn't worth it. This will never work. I have 23 episodes in, almost no subscribers. Nobody even notices. Nobody's even listening to my podcast anyway, so I should just quit. No matter what I do, this podcast just doesn't seem to be growing. Thoughts like this, these are all propaganda messages from your own enemy that is trying to get you to quit. You've had these thoughts if you've been a podcaster, or thoughts similar to that, okay? Now here's a random off-the-cuff example. Let's say you have a podcast to help real estate agents close more sales and sell more homes. Maybe the propaganda for somebody like that might be something like this: there are too many realtors already, or the market's too saturated, the market's too competitive, or the housing market isn't good right now. I'm not good enough with people. Things like that, excuses that are demoralizing in a person's head that will get them to quit. If I were to use those things, if I was doing a real estate podcast, I would talk to those things, because those are the pieces of propaganda that often go through the heads of those kinds of people. So think on the emotional level when applying this. So think about this concept of propaganda and how it applies to your podcast and its ideal listeners. Right now, I want you to make a short list of the negative thoughts, doubts, fears, bad feelings, negative stories, and more that goes through the heads of your listeners that hangs them up and slows them down as they're trying to accomplish their mission that your podcast is here to help them accomplish. Write those down. And look, if you know any other podcasters that this episode could be helpful for, please share it with them. Just click that share button and share it with them real quick. It only takes about 3 seconds, and it'll help them, and it will help me help them, just like I'm trying to help you. Do you struggle to write compelling and effective brand messaging that gets your podcast noticed? Do you want more people to listen to your podcast, but you struggle to talk about it in a way that grabs their attention and keeps it? If your podcast marketing messaging is not up to par, you are losing listeners. But maybe you don't know anything about copywriting and writing marketing messaging and such. Fortunately for you, I've been doing it for over 17 years. Do you want me to write your podcast marketing messaging for you in a clear, powerful, and compelling way that grabs your ideal listener's attention and makes them want to listen to your podcast over and over again? Each month I take on a small, limited number of clients and rewrite their podcast marketing messaging for them. Yes, I do all the hard work for you, and you just get to enjoy the benefits of it without any of the headaches when I'm done. If you want me to craft clear, distinct, and compelling marketing messaging that grows your podcast for you so you can attract more listeners consistently, send me an email right now at podgasmshow@gmail.com. There's a link in the show notes. And put the word consult in the subject line to check my availability.